Hey there, you are watching Blazing Info. This video is about critical race theory. If you don't want to miss out our videos, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell to get notified every time we post new videos. Introduction. Critical race theory, or CRT, is a theoretical and interpretive mode that examines the appearance of race and racism across dominant culture modes of expression. In adopting this approach, CRT scholars attempt to understand how victims of systematic racism are affected by cultural perceptions of race and how they are able to represent themselves to counter prejudice. Closely connected to such fields as philosophy, history, sociology, and law, CRT scholarships traces racism in America through the nation's legacy of slavery, the civil rights movement, and recent events. As such, CRT scholarship also emphasizes the importance of finding a way for diverse individuals to share their experiences. However, CRT scholars do not only locate an individual's identity and experience of the world in his or her racial identifications, but also their membership to a specific class, gender, nation, sexual orientation, etc. They read these diverse cultural texts as proof of the institutionalized inequalities racialized groups and individuals experience every day. Why use this approach? Adopting a CRT approach to literature or other modes of cultural expression includes much more than simply identifying race, racism, and racialized characters in fictional works. Rather, it emphasizes the importance of examining and attempting to understand the sociocultural forces that shape how we and others perceive, experience, and respond to racism. These scholars treat literature, legal documents, and other cultural works as evidence of American culture's collective values and beliefs. In doing so, they trace racism as dually theoretical and historical experience that affects all members of a community regardless of their racial affiliations or identifications. Additionally, because CRT advocates attending to the various components that shape individual identity, it offers a way of scholars to understand how race interacts with other identities like gender and class. As scholars like Crenshaw and Williams have shown, CRT scholarships can and should be amenable to adopting and adapting theories from related fields like women's studies, feminism, and history. In doing so, CRT has evolved over the last decades to address the various concerns facing individuals affected by racism. Interestingly, CRT scholarship does not only draw attention to and address the concerns of individuals affected by racism, but also those who perpetrate and are seemingly unaffected by racial prejudice. Critique of liberal anti-racism. Derek Bell, for example, wrote a controversial critique of the litigation strategy of NAACP Legal Defense Fund for failing to put out quality of education ahead of racial mixing of students. Liberal law reform tends to treat racism as irrational, aberrational, and intentional. Accordingly, race consciousness in any form is bad even when advanced by people of color. Affirmative action can be defended by conventional library lawyers only as a short-term limited remedy that departs from the ideals of objectivity and smart. Critique of whiteness. Critical race theorists reject the idea that race has a natural referent. Instead, it is a product of social processes of power. They urge recognizing race not as an inherent characteristic of people but instead a product of social practices, because unconscious as well as intentional practices construct racial status, stereotypes, and practices. Legal reforms must address unconscious practices as well as intentional ones. Richard Delgado exposed how criminality tracks images of the noun white, despite statistical evidence that crime by whites is more serious, more common, and more hurtful. Richard Ford explored the use of that color line to demarcate urban and suburban spaces in property, land use, local government, and voting laws. Cheryl Harris developed a conception of whiteness as property, a resource of considerable value and an investment receiving massive legal protections. Re-envisioning race in society. Because critical race theorists argue that imperial objective voice of law so often veils the preparation of racial hierarchy, many of these scholars celebrate personal passionate voices in their voices and teaching. Narratives infuse their works autobiographically, fictional, and allegorical. Critiques of popular culture and contributions to its also characterize critical race writings. Derek Bell spins powerful parables through allegorical dialogues with an imaginary civil rights activist. Kimberly Crenshaw criticizes both the criticism of Black rap group and the group itself. Drawing inspirational figures in African American history and literature, Charles Lawrence urges professors in law schools to reject the false neutrality of the conventional scholar and teacher and instead embrace the storytelling, and the personal voice with efforts to transpose feelings and experience into a language as political discipline. In these and other works, critical race scholars propose compelling visions alongside their critiques of racial and cultural dominance by whites, intersectionality, and division. Rejecting the idea of race as a natural category, critical race scholars join feminists and queer theorists in the project of unearthing the social, cultural, and legal constructions of identities. They study the inflection of racial identities by gender, call mistaken the assumption that race and gender can simply be analyzed, expose the social receptiveness to negative images of black women, and identify the failures of liberal law reform to address the complex features of oppressions experiences, especially by poor women of color. Even progressists tend to erase the situations of women of color in their analysis and proposals, or else require those very individuals to pick one group defined either by race or gender. Here, critical race theorists join some feminist theorists in emphasizing the potential fluidity and latitude for contest over gender, racial, and sexual identities. Common questions. What is the significance of race in contemporary American society? Where, in what ways, and to what ends does race appear in dominant American culture and shape the ways we interact with another? What types of texts and other cultural artifacts reflect dominant culture's perceptions of race? How can scholars convey that racism is a concern that affects all members of society? How does racism continue to function as a persistent force in American society? How can we combat racism to ensure that all members of the American society experience equal representation and access to fundamental rights? How can we accurately reflect the experiences of victims of racism? That's it for this video. What do you think about the concept of racism? Tell us in the comment box below. Till then, goodbye.